China's killing our canola. $45 billion gone. Western farmers bleed. Mark Carney? Silent. Made millions off Beijing's dime. He won't fight. He's Beijing's banker, not our prime minister.
Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to this special edition of Hannaford, a weekly politics show. I'm Nigel Hannaford. It is Friday, April the 11th, and my guest today is Petar Pejovic, a Calgary-based senior portfolio manager at Wellington Altus Private Wealth Canada. Welcome back to the show, Peter.
Thank you, Nigel. Pleasure to be back.
Peter, we're doing this special edition, because we're normally Thursdays, but we're doing this special edition tonight, Friday, because thanks to President Trump this past week has been dramatic on the markets, and a lot of people are frightened. As somebody who looks after other people's money, you must have had your phone ringing off the hook this week. So here's the one thing everybody wants to know. Is there any hope?
Nigel, you know there's always hope, and things are not always as bad as they seem. At least that's the way it seems to work out, for me longer term. But no, there's hope. And yes, the phones are ringing off the hook because anybody who turns on the news these days, they'll get a very healthy dose of fear.
So if you could put it in just one sentence, do you buy and hold, or do you lock in your losses now before they get any worse?
The first thing one needs to do, as always is the case, is remain calm and sit down and look at everything that is occurring objectively with as little emotion as possible. The way we see it is that there is a lot of statecraft being employed by the U.S. administration, and statecraft is when essentially you don't show it's kind of like a poker game. You don't show all your cards as a politician or as an administration right up front. You have an end goal, and you want to achieve that end goal, but you got to be careful how you get there, because if you overexpose yourself on that path, you may get derailed. So a lot of what you're hearing, a lot of the fear that you're seeing, some of it's real, but some of it is meant to achieve a means to an end. So we can definitely talk more about that.
Well, let's do that. The popular narrative is that President Trump is an idiot and is like an out-of-control bulldozer in world markets. Or my, more kindly way of putting it, that his laser focus on what he thinks are America's best interests is doing untold and irreparable damage to the rest of the world. So, statecraft, China, bond markets, refinancing of the U.S. debt. Can you put all that together in a way that makes sense of what he has done in the last 2 weeks? First imposing extra tariffs and then taking them off for everybody except China, which now has, is it 104 or 140? It moves so fast, I lose track of it. But I bet
you have to check your tweets every 5 minutes to know what the exact number is, for that moment. But no, that is all statecraft. So, when talking to people, if I took the approach that, Trump doesn't know what he's doing, Trump's an idiot, and so forth, then I'd probably become even more popular. However, that may not be the case. You see, you have to almost just rewind here and see, what are they trying to accomplish and why? So, so first of all, and this is a very complex topic, but at the end of the day, the crux of the problem are deficits. So, and a couple of deficits in particular, one is the fiscal deficit. So if you have a fiscal deficit of, say, $2 trillion on a $37 trillion debt, that would mean that the national debt is growing by $2 trillion a year. And that is unsustainable. That's just the end and the be all of it. It is absolutely unsustainable. And then when you look at the interest payments on that debt now, basically approaching, and if you extrapolate its growth rate, possibly exceeding at $1 trillion a year by the end of this year, then you got a real problem on your hands, because now that starts to, say, exceed the budget of the U.S. military in terms of interest expense. So that's one deficit that they wish to reduce, and then the other one, which is contributory to that, would be the trade deficit. And that's what we've been hearing a lot of recently in terms of the trade deficit of the U.S. to China and to the rest of the world, which is where the statecraft comes in. So, Nigel, do you want to talk a little bit more about the trade deficit and how that might work?
Well, yeah, let's do that. The trade deficit, and also the Department of Government Efficiency, and it does sound, comically bureaucratic, but in actual fact, that's an agency of government with a limited span, a sunset clause in it, and it is actually uncovering enormous and ridiculous expenditures. Again, if you take your eyes off it for a day, you lose it. But the last time I heard, they'd identified something like $1 trillion. That is just foolish expenditure. So are you saying that taking the sum total of what the U.S. administration is doing and not just being focused on tariffs, they are in fact seeking to save money in government and appear to be succeeding, that they have that they are working on the trade deficit through tariffs, and that, of course, when you apply a tariff, anything that does come in is revenue to the government. And then right. I recall that we were speaking a while ago about the import of gold and the possible revaluation of gold as a way of reducing the severity of the national debt, the total national debt. Like you use the analogy of, if you have a house that's $1 million and you're worth $1 million and you have $100,000 in the bank, a debt of $100,000, you don't worry too much. But if the debt is $1 million and the house is $100,000, then you've got every reason to be concerned. So So taking all of these things together, can you place the tariff actions within the overall U.S. approach and maybe rate how well it's working for them?
Yeah, so it's going to be too early to say how well it works, although they've been in these similar places before, and similar policies have worked historically, post-World War II, post-World War I, and also post-Civil War. Now, again, it's just important to almost kind of refocus on what the main goal is, and that is to reduce the deficit, the fiscal deficit, and to reduce the trade deficit. So now going back again to the fiscal deficit, very simple. If you have a deficit, if you're running a deficit, say in your household, and what does that mean? It means you're spending more money than you're making. So how do you fix that? It's difficult, but simple. You need to make more on one side, so increase your revenue. And you need to spend less on the other side, which is decrease your expenditures. And that's exactly what the U.S. administration is trying to do. So on the revenue side, you already mentioned it, Nigel. Tariffs increase revenue, and currently they're targeting anywhere from $300 billion to $600 billion of increased revenue through tariffs. And then on the expenditure side, you already mentioned DOGE. So that's one way they're trying to reduce their expenditure. But then the other way is going to be to reduce the interest expense that I referred to earlier. And how do you reduce interest expense? And there's really only a couple of ways. One is to reduce the national debt, which they're nowhere near accomplishing at this point in time. They'd be happy if they can just reduce the deficit before they could even begin to think about reducing the debt. But, if they can get interest rates down, so if they can somehow get interest rates down, which they have been coming down, and when I say down, and when I say interest rates, I mean the bond market. You see, the Federal Reserve tracks the 2-year Treasury bond as one of its main targets in terms of how to set their overnight interest rates. And currently, that 2-year Treasury bond is hovering just under 4%. And has been trending downward now for weeks. So one of the reasons it's been trending downward, ironically, is all this uncertainty that we've been seeing. So, in a really very strange way, and this now again goes back to statecraft, in a very strange way, all this uncertainty, all this fear, and so forth that we've been seeing is bringing down interest rates in the bond market. And as those rates come down, when treasury bonds come due, and the U.S. government needs to renew those treasury bonds, and there's trillions that need to be renewed this year. Leave $6 trillion in June, and there's more towards the end of the year. Those bonds get renewed at a lower interest rate, and when they get renewed at a lower interest rate, the U.S. federal government saves money. When they save money, they reduce that fiscal deficit. So, is that an accident or is that planned?
Well, if it's not an accident, then Trump is obviously a superior intellect to most of us, because sometimes it's hard to follow, even when you have it explained to you. Especially in the last couple of days, there's been quite a few articles, mostly from the left-wing media, emanating from the United States. Like I noticed that the lead article on this yesterday on the National Post came from an American author. I don't know where they stand politically, but they certainly were delighted to write that Trump had blinked when he suddenly removed these tariffs. And I've heard the argument advanced as recently as yesterday that in actual fact bond rates are going up. So just because of those uncertainties and the different things we're being told, are bond rates going up? You just said they were going down. That sounds better. And did Trump blink?
Okay, so just to answer the question on bond rates, first of all, it depends on the time frame you're looking at. Did they blink up this week? Short answer is yes, slightly, but they're still quite significantly down from where they were last month and in February. So nothing ever goes up or down in a straight line. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. So you have to look at the overarching trend, and the overarching trend is down. Until proven otherwise, but at this point in time, it's still down. Although this week, yes, it did tick up. So then back to statecraft. So once again, it'd be very popular if I said that he blinked, and who knows, maybe he did blink. But here's the thing, and that I've been thinking about for several weeks now with respect to these tariffs. So let's just kind of back up again and take a bird's eye view of the trade deficit, first of all, which is one of the reasons we're going to tariffs. So if you just look at goods and not services, the U.S. trade deficit to the world is something like $1.2 trillion, which is, by the way, is a colossal number. Now, if you include services, and because the U.S. does a lot of services, that number drops probably from 1.2 trillion to somewhere around $800 billion. It's still a very, very big number, even when you include services. Their trade deficit to China, on the services side, the data is really not clear. It's very poor data on services with respect to China. But on the goods side, it's a little bit more clear. It's probably just a little bit under $300 billion. So net, if you're looking at goods, about 1/4 of the U.S. Trade deficit is with China, and then 3/4 is with the rest of the world. So, and China is also, the competitor, let's just say, to the U.S. With respect to economic and political power. So I've always suspected that really the main target in these so-called trade wars really is China, and always was China. Sure, everybody else is involved as well, but if you start with tariffs on everybody, and then you slowly reduce those tariffs on most countries, with the exception of China, what might be happening here is you might be left with essentially uncovering the main target all along, and that could be an element of statecraft right there.
Well, okay. So because I'm old, I remember this happening in real time. But back in the last century, at the end of the 80s, at the end of the Reagan era, it was deemed that it would be a good thing for the world if China were brought, which had been sort of excluded from a lot of things, was actually brought into the mainstream. exposure to the World Trade Organization and international trade would be good for them. That would raise their hopes, raise their standard of living. They would become more peaceful and less dangerous. And as it was written, so it was done. Well, they didn't play by the rules. This is the sort of the conservative view of history here. Obviously, if you're a leftist, you won't think like this. But the Chinese didn't play by the rules, and instead, aided by unpatriotic business owners in America, America offshored production to China, and is now in a vulnerable position, both militarily and economically. And President Trump, we're saying, has decided that he is going to do to China what Reagan did to the USSR with Star Wars, and tariffs are part of it, and so are the other things that we were talking about. So there you are. There's a sort of a little potted history and an explanation for all things, which may be completely wrong, but is there any truth in any of it?
The short answer is there may be truth in that. We don't know yet, but certainly we'll be paying attention to how that progresses over time. But let's back up again and just say how we got here. Why did the United States offshore production to China, back in the day, let's call it in the 70s and the 80s to start? And there are many reasons, but one of them was, in the United States, we had very high inflation, like very, very high inflation, which led to very high interest rates, which were causing all sorts of problems. You may remember that. I was pretty young at the time, but I remember that as it was occurring. So Kissinger and the U.S. administration at the time had this grand idea, and with costs. It was no idea is not without consequence. But the idea was essentially to export the inflation outside of the United States, essentially to China, by exporting production of goods and factories and manufacturing and so forth outside of the United States, to China, in the effort to bring down interest rates by bringing down inflation. And to a large degree, it did work. And again, just a quick little mechanism. Obviously, if jobs are being exported overseas, there's less money in the U.S. system after that is complete, which means less demand for goods and services, as there's less money to chase those goods and services. Furthermore, if China is exporting goods into the United States, that means we are exporting money outside of the United States and Canada. Canada wasn't all that much different. And when you export money out of a country, that means that wealth is essentially being taken out of that country and sent over to the exporting country, in this case, China, which long term makes the Chinese obviously very wealthy, and slowly but surely, makes the average middle class American poor over time. So that is what Trump is now targeting, because fast forward now several decades, what has occurred is essentially there's too many people in the United States that are not doing well as a result of all this. They don't necessarily have as many good quality, high paying jobs as they would like. And there's now a concerted effort to bring that production back into the United States, to bring those jobs back into the United States, and then to have more wealth accumulate and reinvigorate the middle class. Which I don't know if that's maybe being communicated as well as it should be. But if you definitely listen to and read the actual policy of the U.S. administration, that does appear to be their goal, which by virtue means that the trade deficit needs to come down, and tariffs are a tool to achieve that means. It's complicated.
Pardon?
It is complicated when you piece all this together.
It is, and the purpose of this discussion is actually to be helpful to people who are trying to look at their own lives, make their own decisions, and think, what's going on? How is this going to affect me? Am I going to be living on the street? Now, let's just talk about inflation as it affects us today, April, 2025. If a person is thinking about making a large investment, whether it's in a motor car or a home renovation or whether they're thinking about moving house, all the big decisions that people have to make. They know what the price is today. Do you think inflation is something that they need to be concerned about if they were needing to make these purchases in the next year?
Short answer is no, Nigel. So, which I know is again a contrarian opinion to what is typically being disseminated, by a lot of pundits in the media, and I'll explain why. So you have to again back up and see how do tariffs historically how have they worked with respect to inflation. Obviously, if taken at face value, it would make complete sense that tariffs would be inflationary, because you think, well, if you're adding a 10-20% tariff on something, surely the price of that item must go up, and surely if that happens everywhere, it's inflationary. But wait a minute, you need to back up just a bit and look at the totality of circumstance. So let's just say we're talking about a 10% tariff. So historically, if you look at how this has worked in years past, because, we've had tariffs forever, in one way, shape or form, we have a lot of experience with tariffs and how they ended up working. So on a 10% tariff, typically the consumer does not absorb the totality of that increase. So you might say, and these are rough numbers because it can be different in different circumstances, but possibly 2.5%, let's just say a quarter of that 10% tariff is a one-time price adjustment to the consumer, which then begs the question, what about the other 3/4, the other 7.5%? Well, there's typically and very often a foreign exchange adjustment, which so the foreign exchanges will adjust to reduce the impact of that tariff. Next, the supplier typically will absorb some of that tariff, or the exporter, and then the importer will also absorb a portion of that tariff. And even if you look at a 10% tariff and say, well, even if it's only 2.5% or so, that's still an increase. But wait a minute, you have to look at the definition of inflation. For something to be inflationary, that inflation has to be perpetual and it has to continue rolling forward, meaning that you have to continually get a price increase on that product for that reason. And that's not the case in this instance. It's a one-time price increase. So the price goes up one time, one day, 1 month, and then that's it, unless tariffs go higher. Then that changes the equation a bit. But if it stays static at that point in time, that's just the so-called new normal. It doesn't necessarily progress from then on. For inflation to be progressive, it needs to continue. And then the flip side of that as well is, because again, this is complicated stuff. There's demand destruction when the price of that item goes up. So, for example, if we're talking grapes and the price of grapes goes up to a price that maybe you or I we look at that price and we go, I don't need those grapes that bad. But hey, those blueberries are on sale. So I'm just not going to buy those grapes. I'm going to buy those blueberries. Well, what happens if everybody that's walking by the grape aisle does the same thing and says, I'm going to pass on the grapes? The price of those grapes will actually come down, kind of back to where the consumer is actually willing to buy those grapes at. Otherwise, substitution occurs. And beyond that, even if the price did perpetuate higher, eventually we might just figure out ways to grow grapes more locally. Say in Kelowna, for example, and avoid the tariffs outright.
Yes, so, you look like you've got you look like you might have vineyards behind you, actually. Yes. Well, I mean, that's certainly the way that they taught me economics at university. In practical terms, I'm still waiting for the price of Marmite and certain other British specialties to come down in just the way that you have described. And I will take hope from what you've just said.
This is theoretical, of course.
Life happens. You've in the past recommended hard assets. Do you still recommend hard assets for people who are looking for a safe place to put their money?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You mentioned earlier about the potential of gold becoming something bigger. possibly in this financial system, and that's always been the case, and that's still the case today. So for example, we talked about trade. We talked about deficits. At the end of the day, the goal is to reduce the deficit, to manage the debt better, because if it continues on, then the interest expense simply gets too high in the long run, and that could lead to a far, far worse situation than we see currently here today. So as much as none of us particularly like what's happening, the reality of it is there is an effort to fix certain problems that exist in the system, in the financial system, to avoid a much larger problem down the road. And one of the ways to fix this, so to speak, is, gold at some point we don't know for sure, but it may play a much larger role in the financial system. It's already a reserve asset at multiple central banks around the world and treasury departments. If the debt situation at some point becomes a little more untenable, let's just say, one option is always going to be to simply take that gold that's sitting on the balance sheets of different central banks like the U.S. Federal Reserve or the Treasury Department, and revalue it at a higher price. And if you revalue it at a higher price, then all of a sudden the debt that that country has may not seem so big in relation to the value of gold that's being held in reserve. So for that reason and many other reasons, we've always held a broad-based portfolios that have equities, stocks, have fixed income bonds, cash and cash equivalents for liquidity, and then some precious metals, mostly gold, possibly a little bit of silver, and other commodities as well, to round up a much more balanced mix that's able to weather a wide variety of storms better than if one had only equities, alone.
Peter, that's a beautiful segue to the word from our sponsors that I'm going to deliver now. This episode of Hannaford is sponsored by New World Precious Metals, based right here in Calgary. Years of inflationary money printing and rising debt have decimated the savings of the average Canadian. Gold and silver are the only currencies that have held their value for thousands of years. Last year saw 30% gains. New World Precious Metals offers unique platforms to help protect and grow your hard-earned wealth with gold and silver. Check them out at newworldpm.com. Peter, thank you very much for your insights today. They're always valuable. And for the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.
What does success mean to you? Peace of mind? Financial freedom? Generational wealth? What do you see in your future? Investing in gold and silver can help you get there. Through our trading partners, New World Precious Metals offers safe, affordable, secure international accounts to help you meet your unique financial goals. Connect with one of our experienced team members. Invest in gold and silver today.